November 1944, near the German border. The forest is quiet, cold air moves slowly through the pines. Wet leaves cling to the boots of American infantry as they advance between the trees. Every step is careful, every sound feels louder than it should. The forest here is thick, almost unnatural in its silence. Visibility stretches only a few dozen meters. Beyond that, shadows swallow everything. Somewhere ahead, a rifle cracks. One American soldier drops instantly, the shot echoing and then vanishing into the dense woodland. No muzzle flash, no clear direction. Just the knowledge that someone is watching, waiting. German snipers have been here for hours, some of them for days. Hidden in carefully chosen positions along the forest line, they studied movement patterns, memorized paths, and waited for the moment a helmet or shoulder appeared between the trunks. In battles like those fought in the forests of Western Germany during operations, such as the Battle of Hürtgen Forest, this kind of deadly patience became a routine part of the war. The Americans soon realized something else. The forest itself had become the enemy's strongest weapon. And before long, commanders would decide that if the enemy could not be seen, the forest itself would have to disappear. Allied forces had stormed ashore during the Normandy landings, breaking open Adolf Hitler's Atlantic defenses and beginning the long push toward Germany itself. Through the summer, American, British, and Canadian armies moved steadily across France. Cities fell one after another. German units retreated, reorganized, and fought delaying actions wherever terrain allowed them to slow the advance. But as the Allied armies approached the German border, the character of the battlefield shifted dramatically. The open fields of France gave way to fortified villages, rivers, hills, and vast stretches of dense woodland along Germany's western frontier. One of the most difficult of these regions lay near the edge of the Ardennes and the German borderlands, a place of thick forests, narrow roads, and limited visibility. Here, German commanders recognized an opportunity. If they could not stop the Allied advance everywhere, they could at least slow it. And slowing the Americans was strategically valuable. Germany in late 1944 was under enormous pressure on multiple fronts. The Allies were building momentum after the breakout from Normandy. Every week that German forces could delay the Allied advance meant more time to reinforce defensive lines, rebuild shattered units, and prepare for counteroffensives. The forests offered exactly the kind of terrain where a smaller defending force could create disproportionate resistance. Inside the woods, American advantages in mobility and air power were reduced. Tanks had difficulty maneuvering between trees and muddy paths. Aircraft struggled to identify targets hidden beneath thick canopy. Artillery could still be used, but spotting the enemy became much harder. For German infantry units, this environment suited defensive doctrine perfectly. German military planning had long emphasized the use of terrain to offset enemy superiority. Defensive lines were not always continuous trenches like those of the First World War. Instead, they often consisted of concealed strongpoints, overlapping fields of fire, and small, flexible groups of soldiers who could ambush advancing troops and then disappear back into cover. Within the forests near the German border, these tactics became even more effective. Snipers, machine gun teams, and observers were positioned carefully along likely American approaches. Trees offered concealment. Fallen logs created natural firing positions. Camouflage netting blended men and weapons into the environment so thoroughly that even experienced soldiers sometimes walked within meters of a hidden position before realizing the danger. German snipers, in particular, played an outsized role in this environment, unlike in open terrain where large formations dominated the battlefield. A single sniper could halt an entire platoon's advance if his position remained undiscovered. This created an atmosphere of constant tension. American soldiers entering these forests quickly learned that movement itself could attract deadly attention. Helmets, rifle barrels, or even the glint of equipment might reveal a position to someone already watching through a scoped rifle. The result was slow, exhausting progress. Units advanced by meters rather than kilometers. Patrols probed the woods carefully. Engineers searched for mines hidden beneath leaves and soil. Radio operators whispered updates to commanders who often struggled to understand exactly where the enemy lines were. They allowed the forest to break the battlefield into small, confusing fragments. For American commanders, this created a serious operational problem. The objective was clear: secure routes into Germany and continue the advance toward the Rhine, but each mile of woodland could hide dozens of unseen defenders. And each day the advance slowed. German forces gained time. By September and October 1944, the fighting in these forests had become some of the most grueling combat on the Western Front. Units rotated in and out of the line as casualties mounted and exhaustion spread through the ranks. Rain turned paths into mud. Artillery churned the ground. Visibility remained poor. And always, somewhere ahead, there were hidden rifles waiting for movement. Among American troops, the forest began to develop a reputation. It was a place where the enemy was rarely visible, yet constantly present. A battlefield where the sound of a single shot could freeze an entire company in place, and as the weeks went on, American commanders began to consider a difficult reality. If the enemy could not be easily found inside the forest, then perhaps the forest itself would have to be removed from the equation. By late 1944, the forests along the German border had become something more than terrain. They had turned into a battlefield system of their own. Much of the fighting took place in the dense woodlands associated with operations like the Battle of Hurtgen Forest, where American units moved into one of the most difficult combat environments of the entire Western Front. The forest stretched across hills and valleys cut by narrow roads and streams. Tall pine and fir trees blocked long sight lines. Thick undergrowth hid mines, wires, and hidden positions. For soldiers on the ground, distance shrank dramatically. In open country, infantry might spot enemy movement hundreds of meters away. In this forest, contact often happened at less than 50 meters, sometimes much closer. The trees absorbed sound, distorted direction, and created constant uncertainty. A rifle shot could echo in ways that made it difficult to determine where it came from. German defenders understood this environment intimately. Many units had prepared positions before American forces arrived. Paths were watched. Roads were registered for artillery fire. Snipers took advantage of patience and concealment. They selected positions with overlapping visibility between trunks, sometimes cutting small, nearly invisible firing lanes through branches. Others worked alongside spotters who watched for movement while the sniper remained hidden and motionless for hours. American soldiers soon realized that the forest line ahead of them was not just a natural barrier. It was alive with observers. This slowed the tempo of operations significantly. Patrols moved cautiously, sometimes advancing only a few hundred meters in an entire day. Units paused repeatedly to identify suspected sniper fire or hidden machine gun nests. Engineers moved forward to clear mines that had been carefully placed along likely routes of advance. Weather made the situation worse. Autumn rain soaked the ground, turning trails into thick mud that swallowed boots and slowed vehicles. Heavy equipment struggled to move along narrow forest roads. Tanks could support infantry in some sectors, but maneuvering them between trees was dangerous and often impractical. Supply lines became difficult to maintain. Food, ammunition, and medical evacuation all depended on those same narrow routes that German defenders frequently targeted with artillery or ambush. A single destroyed vehicle could block a road for hours. Meanwhile, artillery continued to shape the battlefield. The United States Army had one of the most powerful artillery systems of the war. American divisions relied heavily on coordinated fire support, batteries of howitzers capable of delivering massive bombardments across wide areas. Forward observers moved with infantry units, calling in fire missions to suppress or destroy enemy positions. But in the forest, even artillery had limitations. Spotters could not always see their targets. Tree cover masked enemy movement. Shells detonating high in the canopy sometimes produced deadly fragments that rained down unpredictably, affecting both sides. Still, artillery remained one of the few tools capable of breaking hidden defenses. Reports from the front described a pattern. Infantry advancing cautiously through the woods would encounter sudden sniper fire or machine gun bursts from unseen positions. Attempts to flank those positions often ran into additional hidden defenders. And time mattered. Elsewhere on the Western Front, Allied planners were already thinking about the next phase of the war. Pushing deeper into Germany and crossing the Rhine, Delays in the forest threatened to slow broader operational plans. As casualties increased, pressure mounted on commanders to find a solution. The problem was not simply the number of German troops. It was their invisibility. The longer American units remained pinned down by unseen fire, the more the psychological toll grew. Soldiers began to fear the tree line itself, every branch, every shadow, every opening between trunks. Because somewhere within that wall of forest, someone could be waiting, and eventually the question became unavoidable. If the enemy used the forest as cover, what would happen if that cover was destroyed? The answer would soon arrive in the form of coordinated firepower, the kind that could reshape the battlefield in minutes. In forest warfare, patience often mattered more than firepower. German snipers operating along the Western Front in late 1944 were not simply marksmen placed randomly along a defensive line. Many were experienced soldiers who understood how terrain could shape the outcome of a battle. In wooded environments like those fought during the Battle of Hürtgen Forest, the sniper's role became even more important. Their objective was rarely to eliminate large numbers of enemy troops. Instead, it was disruption. A single carefully timed shot could halt movement, delay patrols, and force entire American units to slow down or take cover. The psychological effect mattered almost as much as the casualty itself. When soldiers believed they were constantly being watched, they became cautious, movement slowed. Coordination became more difficult. German snipers often operated with support. Spotters helped observe approaches while the sniper remained concealed. Positions were selected with extreme care, behind fallen logs, within thick foliage, or sometimes elevated among branches that blended naturally into the forest canopy. Camouflage clothing and disciplined stillness allowed them to remain undetected for long periods. In some sectors, these positions overlooked narrow routes American troops had to use. Paths through the forest, supply trails, and small clearings all became potential observation zones. A sniper could wait silently as patrols passed, choosing the exact moment to fire when it would cause the greatest confusion, but this strategy also required endurance. Remaining motionless in cold, damp conditions for hours, sometimes days, demanded physical and mental resilience. The forest environment was harsh even without enemy fire, rain-soaked uniforms. Temperatures dropped at night. Visibility constantly shifted with fog and drifting smoke from artillery. Still, for many German defenders, this method worked. As long as the forest remained intact, it provided concealment, unpredictability, and time. And time was exactly what Germany needed in late 1944. But on the other side of the trees, American infantry were experiencing the same battlefield in a very different way. For American infantry entering these forests, the war became intensely personal. Unlike large battles fought across open terrain, forest combat reduced the scale of warfare. Soldiers often saw only a small portion of the battlefield around them, their squad, the trees ahead, and the uncertain space between trunks where danger could appear at any moment. Many American troops had advanced rapidly across France during the months after the Normandy landings. That campaign involved movement, maneuver, and momentum. But inside the forests along Germany's border, everything slowed dramatically. Patrols moved carefully, step by step. Infantrymen learned to watch the upper parts of trees as much as the ground. Snipers could be positioned almost anywhere. The crack of a rifle often came without warning, and sometimes without a clear direction. When a shot rang out, the reaction was immediate. Soldiers dropped behind trunks, pressed into the ground, scanning for movement. Squad leaders attempted to determine where the shot had come from, but the forest distorted sound. What seemed like a shot from the left might actually come from farther ahead or slightly behind. This uncertainty created constant stress. In many cases, units would halt their advance until artillery or supporting weapons could suppress suspected positions. That meant waiting, sometimes for hours. While rain fell and visibility remained limited, medical evacuation was another challenge. If a soldier was wounded deep inside the forest, reaching him quickly was difficult. Stretcher teams had to navigate muddy paths and narrow clearings while still exposed to enemy fire. Helicopter evacuation did not exist in this war zone yet. Everything depended on manpower and coordination. Despite these conditions, American infantry units continued pushing forward. Their mission was clear: move through the forest, locate enemy defenses, and open routes deeper into Germany. Engineers cleared mines, scouts probed ahead. Machine gun teams provided covering fire. But over time, commanders began to see a pattern. The same obstacles kept appearing: hidden snipers, concealed machine guns, and defensive positions that were difficult to identify until they opened fire. This raised a critical question within the American command structure. If the forest itself allowed these defenses to function so effectively, could artillery be used not just to target the enemy, but to fundamentally change the environment of the battlefield? The answer depended on the men whose job it was to see what others could not. Forward observers. And their decisions would soon shape what happened next. Artillery spotters were among the most important and most vulnerable soldiers in forest warfare. These men moved with forward units, carrying radios, maps, and range calculations that connected frontline troops with the powerful artillery batteries positioned miles behind them. Their job was to identify targets and direct fire with precision. In open terrain, this was challenging but manageable. In the forest, it became extremely complex. Spotters often climbed small rises, broken structures, or temporary observation posts just to gain a partial view through the trees. Sometimes they worked from the edges of clearings where visibility was slightly better. Even then, much of what they relied on came from sound. Reports from infantry and subtle movement within the woodland. They listened for gunfire. They watched for disturbed branches. They tracked where soldiers were taking fire and estimated where hidden positions might be located. Once a suspected target area was identified, the spotter would contact artillery batteries and begin adjusting fire, a process known as walking shells onto a position. Initial rounds would land nearby. Then corrections would be given until the barrage covered the suspected enemy area. But as fighting continued, a new realization emerged. Many enemy positions were not isolated. They were spread across entire sections of the forest line. And if that was true, targeting individual positions might not be enough. Some commanders began to consider something far larger: the idea of using concentrated artillery not just to hit hidden defenders, but to strip away the forest that protected them. The decision, however, would require coordination at a much higher level. And once it was made, the battlefield would change in ways few soldiers had ever witnessed before. Behind the front lines, American commanders were studying reports that arrived daily from units fighting in the forests near the German border. These reports described a pattern that was becoming impossible to ignore. Advances were slow. Casualties were steady, enemy positions were difficult to locate, and the terrain itself seemed to be favoring the defenders at almost every stage. In areas tied to the fighting around the Battle of Hürtgen Forest, staff officers reviewed reconnaissance maps marked with suspected sniper zones, minefields, and hidden machine gun nests. What emerged from these briefings was a clear understanding: the forest line was acting as a natural defensive shield. German forces did not need large numbers of troops to delay the American advance. They only needed concealment. This forced commanders to reconsider traditional methods of clearing enemy defenses. Normally, infantry and armor would work together to locate and eliminate positions through maneuver. But tanks struggled inside dense woodland. Visibility was limited. Even when enemy fire was identified, flanking movements were often slow and risky. At higher levels of command, the conversation began to shift. Instead of focusing only on destroying individual enemy positions, planners started examining whether the terrain itself could be altered. American artillery units possessed enormous firepower, capable of delivering sustained barrages across wide areas. If coordinated correctly, artillery could saturate sections of forest large enough to disrupt hidden defensive networks. But such a decision carried risks. Heavy bombardment inside dense woodland could cause unpredictable. Falling timber could block movement routes. Visibility might improve, but so might chaos. Commanders had to weigh the cost carefully. Still, the strategic goal remained unchanged: maintain momentum toward Germany's interior and prevent the enemy from slowing the advance indefinitely. Gradually, planning began for fire missions that were larger, longer, and more concentrated than the localized strikes used earlier in the fighting. If approved, these barrages would not simply target a sniper's position or a suspected bunker, they would target the forest itself. And that decision reflected another dimension of the battle that was becoming increasingly important: the psychological strain on soldiers fighting within the woods. Forest warfare placed extraordinary pressure on the human mind, unlike open battlefields, where the enemy could sometimes be seen forming lines or moving across terrain. The woodland environment created a constant sense of uncertainty. Soldiers rarely knew exactly where the enemy was. Every sound carried meaning. Every shadow could conceal movement. For American troops, this uncertainty often translated into fatigue that went beyond physical exhaustion. Sleep was limited. Patrols were tense. Even routine tasks, eating, repairing equipment, moving supplies, happened under the awareness that a sniper might be observing from somewhere within the trees. Over time, this produced a quiet form of psychological warfare. German defenders did not need to fire constantly. Sometimes the mere possibility of a hidden rifle was enough to slow operations and increase stress among advancing units. A single well-timed shot could stop movement across an entire sector for hours. At the same time, German soldiers were facing their own pressures. They understood that the Allied advance across Western Europe was steadily approaching Germany itself. Many units fighting in these forests were under strength, short on supplies, and aware that American artillery and logistics gave the Allies a significant advantage. This created a situation where both sides relied heavily on patience. The Germans depended on concealment and defensive positioning to delay the enemy as long as possible. American troops depended on discipline and coordination to continue advancing despite limited visibility and constant danger. But psychological pressure has a tipping point. Eventually, commanders must choose between enduring the environment or changing it. In this case, that decision would involve unleashing one of the most powerful elements of the American war effort: artillery. And once it began, the experience of warfare inside the forest would transform rapidly. World War II on the Western Front was, in many ways, a contest between mobility and firepower. American forces possessed enormous industrial strength. Their artillery systems were highly coordinated, flexible, and capable of delivering large volumes of fire quickly. Communications networks allowed forward observers to call in support from multiple batteries with impressive speed. In contrast, German defensive strength often relied on tactical positioning and terrain. Inside forests, like those encountered during the Battle of Hürtgen Forest, this balance temporarily shifted in favor of the defenders. Technology alone could not easily overcome concealment. Tanks were limited. Aircraft struggled to identify targets beneath tree cover. This meant artillery became the key variable. American artillery units used a range of techniques designed to overwhelm defensive positions. Time-on-target missions allowed shells from multiple batteries to land simultaneously, maximizing shock and confusion. Concentrated barrages could saturate wide areas before infantry advanced. But using artillery inside dense forest terrain created a unique effect. Shells striking trees often exploded before reaching the ground, scattering lethal fragments downward in all directions. Branches shattered, trunks splintered. The canopy itself became a secondary source of debris and shrapnel. Over time, repeated bombardments could strip large sections of woodland. What had once been thick forest might be transformed into broken ground filled with shattered trees, craters, and smoke. For American planners, this offered both an opportunity and a warning. Destroying the forest could expose hidden defenders, including snipers who depended on cover to operate effectively. But it would also turn the battlefield into a chaotic landscape where movement remained difficult. Still, as reports continued to arrive from the front lines, the conclusion became harder to avoid. If the enemy used the forest as protection, overwhelming firepower might remove that protection entirely. And soon, orders would begin moving through artillery, command networks preparing for a fire mission that would reshape the battlefield. A mission that would begin with silence and end with thousands of shells tearing through the trees. By late autumn 1944, the pattern was unmistakable. Reports arriving from American infantry units fighting through the forests near the German border described the same problem again and again. Unseen defenders, sniper fire emerging from deep within the tree line, and advances that stalled almost as soon as they began. In operations connected to the brutal fighting of the Battle of Hürtgen Forest, commanders began reviewing the situation at a broader level. Maps covered with grid markings showed where patrols had been halted, where sniper fire had been reported, and where previous artillery strikes had already taken place. What emerged from those maps was a clear realization: the enemy was not concentrated in a single bunker or trench system. Instead, German defenders were dispersed throughout the forest line, using concealment, elevation, and overlapping observation points to control the ground ahead of them. Individual snipers might be separated by hundreds of meters, yet together they created a defensive web that slowed entire battalions. American commanders faced a difficult choice. They could continue the slow process of probing the forest, locating each hidden position one by one, clearing it, and then moving forward again. But this method was costing time and lives. Every meter gained required careful reconnaissance, mine clearing, and repeated engagements with defenders who often vanished before being fully identified. Or they could apply overwhelming force. The United States Army's artillery system was built for exactly this kind of moment. Behind the front lines, batteries of howitzers stood ready, some belonging to divisional artillery units, others attached from corps-level formations capable of delivering massive concentrations of fire. Forward observers had already been collecting coordinates, suspected sniper zones, machine gun nests, areas where patrols had repeatedly encountered resistance. These grid references were passed to artillery command posts where fire plans were being prepared. But what was being planned now was larger than a typical fire mission. Instead of striking individual targets, the proposal involved saturating entire sections of forest line with sustained bombardment. The objective was not just suppression. It was transformation. If the bombardment was intense enough, the thick canopy that concealed German defenders could be shattered. Trees would splinter, branches would collapse. Observation points would disappear. Hidden positions might be exposed or destroyed entirely. Still, even with the power of American artillery, such an operation required careful coordination. Infantry units needed to withdraw to safe distances before the barrage began. Artillery batteries had to synchronize firing schedules. Communication lines between observers and command posts were checked repeatedly. Ammunition stockpiles were moved forward to ensure that guns could maintain sustained fire. Meanwhile, the soldiers at the front sensed that something was changing. Forward observers moved more frequently between command posts and frontline positions. Radio traffic increased. Artillery crews miles behind the line began preparing guns, checking elevation settings, calculating trajectories. Inside the forest, German defenders continued their routine. Snipers remained in position, watching the approaches where American infantry had been advancing cautiously for days. From their perspective, the pattern seemed familiar. Occasional artillery rounds had fallen before, but nothing that suggested a major shift in tactics. At least not yet, but higher up the American command chain, the decision had effectively been made: if the forest allowed the defenders to remain invisible, then the forest would no longer remain intact. Orders were transmitted through artillery networks, confirming firing coordinates across a wide stretch of woodland where sniper activity and defensive resistance had been most persistent. Guns were loaded. Observers checked their watches, and across multiple artillery positions, crews waited for the exact moment when the barrage would begin, a moment that would replace the quiet tension of the forest with a sudden, overwhelming storm of fire. Then finally the signal arrived. For a moment, the forest was still. American infantry units had already pulled back from the immediate edge of the tree line, waiting in muddy positions just beyond the zone that had been marked on artillery maps. Many soldiers did not yet know the exact scale of what was about to happen. They only knew that the guns behind them had been preparing for hours. Then the first shells were fired. Miles away, batteries of American howitzers recoiled as their rounds climbed high into the cold autumn sky. Within seconds, more guns joined. The sound began as distant thunder, a steady, rolling concussion that spread across the front. Inside the forest associated with the fighting around the Battle of Hürtgen Forest, the first impacts arrived abruptly. Shells struck the upper canopy before many defenders even realized what was happening. Explosions tore through branches and trunks, sending splintered wood and metal fragments downward in violent bursts. Unlike open terrain, where shells often detonated on the ground, artillery in dense forests produced what soldiers sometimes described as airbursts created by the trees themselves. Branches shattered, limbs broke free. Entire sections of the canopy collapsed under repeated impacts. Within seconds, the quiet woodland turned into chaos. German defenders who had spent hours hidden in carefully selected positions suddenly found those positions disappearing around them. Observation points that had offered concealment were destroyed by falling debris and shockwaves. Some snipers were forced to abandon locations immediately as shattered timber crashed through the ground around them. And the barrage did not stop. American artillery doctrine allowed multiple batteries to fire coordinated missions that covered wide areas simultaneously. Shell after shell landed across the forest line, walking deeper into suspected defensive zones where forward observers had previously reported resistance. The ground shook repeatedly as explosions rippled across the woodland. Tree trunks split apart under the force. Craters opened in the soft forest floor. Smoke, dust, and splintered wood filled the air, reducing visibility even further, but also stripping away the cover that had protected hidden defenders for so long. From American positions behind the line, soldiers could see the transformation unfolding. The distant forest that had once looked dark and solid began to change shape. Explosions burst above the trees, followed by sections of canopy collapsing inward. The sound was constant, a layered roar of artillery firing, shells arriving, and timber breaking under impact. For German units inside the bombardment zone, the experience was overwhelming. Many had expected artillery fire as part of normal combat operations. But the scale of this barrage was different. Instead of short bursts of fire, the bombardment continued in waves designed to saturate large areas of the forest. Communication lines were disrupted. Runners attempting to move between positions faced falling trees and exploding shells. Some defensive groups became isolated almost immediately as the terrain around them changed. Snipers who had relied on long hours of stillness suddenly found themselves exposed. Branches that had hidden them were gone. Camouflage positions collapsed or were buried beneath debris. Even those who survived the initial impacts were forced to move, and movement inside an active artillery barrage was extremely dangerous. Meanwhile, forward observers watched carefully. Their job was not only to begin the barrage, but also to adjust it. As reports came in about likely enemy locations or signs of surviving resistance, artillery fire could be shifted slightly forward, deeper into the forest line. This method ensured that the bombardment did more than shock the defenders. It dismantled the defensive structure that had slowed the American advance for days. Over time, the forest began to resemble something entirely different from the terrain that had existed just hours earlier. Sections of woodland were now broken landscapes of shattered trunks and churned earth. The once dense canopy that had concealed snipers and machine gun teams was reduced in many areas to jagged remnants. When the barrage finally began to slow, a heavy silence settled briefly over the damaged forest. Smoke drifted through broken branches. Pieces of bark and splintered wood still fell slowly to the ground. American infantry units waiting behind the lines prepared themselves to move again, this time toward a forest that no longer looked the same as it had before the guns opened fire. But what they would find inside the shattered tree line would reveal just how costly this transformation had been for both sides. When the artillery finally stopped, the forest no longer resembled the place where the fighting had begun. American infantry units were ordered forward cautiously, advancing once again toward the shattered tree line that had only hours earlier been dense enough to hide entire defensive positions. The ground was uneven, covered with fresh craters, broken branches, and fallen trunks that lay tangled across former paths. Smoke still hung between the trees. As soldiers moved in, they quickly realized that the barrage had done exactly what commanders intended. It had stripped away much of the concealment that German defenders had relied upon throughout the fighting connected to the Battle of Hurtgen Forest. Positions that had once been nearly invisible were now exposed. Some sniper nests had been destroyed entirely. Others were abandoned, their camouflage shattered by falling debris or blast waves. In several places, American troops discovered defensive setups that showed just how carefully German soldiers had used the forest, shallow firing pits reinforced with logs, hidden observation points overlooking narrow approaches, and small teams that had been positioned to cover each other's fields of fire. But the bombardment had not eliminated all resistance. As infantry advanced deeper into the damaged woodland, sporadic gunfire still erupted from surviving defenders who had endured the artillery strike. Some German units had taken shelter in dugouts or behind natural terrain features that offered partial protection from the barrage. Others had simply survived by chance, positioned just outside the most heavily targeted zones. This meant the advance remained dangerous. American squads moved slowly, stepping over shattered timber while scanning the area for movement. Machine gun teams provided covering fire whenever suspected positions were identified. Engineers once again moved forward, checking for mines that might still be hidden beneath layers of debris. The environment itself had changed dramatically. What had once been thick forest now resembled a chaotic battlefield of broken ground. Trees that remained standing were often stripped of branches or split by blast damage. Visibility had improved in some areas, but movement became more difficult because the terrain was clogged with obstacles created by the bombardment. And among those obstacles were these: both sides had suffered losses during the artillery strike and the fighting that followed. Some German defenders had been caught directly in the barrage. Others were found wounded or disoriented among collapsed positions. American units also faced casualties as they moved forward into the disrupted landscape where isolated resistance continued. Medical teams began working immediately. Stretchers were carried through narrow gaps between fallen trunks. Aid stations were established slightly behind the advancing units. Communication lines were re-established so commanders could report progress and coordinate the next phase of operations. From a tactical perspective, the artillery barrage had achieved a critical objective. The defensive web of concealed positions that had slowed the American advance was no longer functioning the same way. Without the intact forest canopy, snipers and observers could not operate as effectively as before. Fields of vision had changed. Camouflage was harder to maintain. But the cost of creating this new battlefield was visible everywhere. The forest itself had been transformed into a scarred landscape that would remain marked long after the battle moved elsewhere. Commanders now faced another reality. Even after such overwhelming firepower, the campaign through these border forests was far from over, because the war in Western Europe was entering a phase where each mile closer to Germany would bring new resistance, new defensive lines, and new decisions about how much destruction was required to keep moving forward. And soon, reports from this shattered forest would influence how future operations were planned across the front. In the days that followed the bombardment, reports moved steadily up the American chain of command. Field officers described the changed conditions inside the forest. The artillery strike had broken many of the defensive advantages that German units had relied upon during the fighting connected to the Battle of Hürtgen Forest. Sniper activity decreased in several sectors where the canopy had been stripped away and observation points destroyed. But the reports also revealed something more complicated. Even when large sections of forest were devastated by artillery, the fighting did not end immediately. German units continued to resist wherever they could establish new positions. Some withdrew deeper into the remaining woodland. Others reorganized along terrain features such as ridgelines, streams, or damaged road networks. One major realization was the sheer power of coordinated artillery when used on a large scale. American forces had already demonstrated strong artillery coordination earlier in the campaign that began with the Normandy landings, but the forest fighting reinforced how decisive massed firepower could be against concealed defensive networks. Artillery was no longer just a support tool. It was increasingly used as a method to reshape terrain itself. In several later operations across Western Europe, American commanders relied more heavily on large preparatory bombardments before sending infantry into heavily defended areas. These barrages were intended to disrupt enemy organization, destroy observation points, and reduce the ability of defenders to conduct ambushes. However, this approach also came with strategic and humanitarian consequences. Heavy artillery created enormous destruction across landscapes that had once been forests, farmland, and villages. In areas like the Hurtgen region, the environment was permanently altered. Fields of broken timber, shell craters, and unexploded ordnance remained long after the battle moved elsewhere. For soldiers who fought there, the psychological memory of those forests remained particularly strong. Many veterans later described the fighting as some of the most exhausting combat they experienced during the entire war in Western Europe. The combination of limited visibility, constant sniper threat, harsh weather, and relentless artillery created a battlefield unlike the fast-moving advances that had followed the Allied breakout from France. At the strategic level, the campaign through these forests did slow the Allied timetable more than planners had originally hoped. German forces, though increasingly strained, succeeded in delaying the American advance long enough to reorganize parts of their defensive system along the German frontier. This delay would become especially significant as the war moved toward one of its most dramatic phases, later in 1944. But even with those delays, the balance of power had shifted decisively. The Allies possessed overwhelming industrial capacity, supply lines, and artillery coordination that German defenders struggled to match over time. Every bombardment, like the one that shattered sections of the forest line, gradually eroded the ability of German units to maintain effective defensive positions. In the months that followed, the war on the Western Front continued moving closer to Germany's interior. Yet the lessons learned inside those forests stayed with the commanders who had fought there. They had seen how a battlefield could be shaped not only by soldiers and weapons, but by the destruction of the environment itself. And in that shattered landscape, the war revealed something deeper about modern combat, the moment when patience, concealment, and careful positioning could suddenly be overwhelmed by industrial-scale firepower, a realization that would echo across the final stages of the war in Europe. Shall I write the reflection now? The forest, once a place of concealment and patience, had been transformed. What had been dense woodland filled with hidden snipers and carefully prepared positions became a scarred landscape of broken trees, craters, and smoke. For the soldiers who fought there, the ground itself seemed to have turned against them, an environment no longer natural, but engineered for survival, destruction, and the relentless logic of war. What this battle revealed about warfare was stark. Modern combat was no longer measured solely by courage, skill, or maneuver. It was also measured by the ability to command overwhelming force, to coordinate destruction on a scale that could reshape terrain and erase the advantages of even the most patient defenders. German snipers, once nearly invisible in their wooded strongholds, were exposed by firepower that spared nothing. The forest line that had been a shield became a liability, and in that transformation lay both tactical brilliance and human cost. Yet the story of these forests is also a human story. The soldiers on both sides endured cold, exhaustion, and fear that seeped into every step through mud and fallen timber. Artillery did not distinguish between fear and courage, only between cover and exposure. The devastation of the landscape mirrored the toll on the human spirit, the quiet, relentless erosion of certainty, safety, and life itself. Ultimately, the battle along these shattered tree lines stands as a reflection on the nature of warfare, a collision between patience and overwhelming force, concealment and industrial firepower. It is a lesson that reverberates beyond tactics and terrain. It is about the fragility of human endurance in the face of machinery, the impermanence of any defensive advantage, and the cost exacted when strategy transforms nature into an instrument of war. In the silence that followed the barrage, as soldiers stepped carefully among the broken trees, the forest held its new truth. The war had moved on, but history remembered the forest not only as ground fought over, but as a witness to patience destroyed, power unleashed, and the high price of advancing through what had once seemed impenetrable.